Good afternoon, everyone. We can just see that there's around 123, 124 participants on the call. My name's Chris Pressler. I'm the University Librarian here at the University of Manchester, and it's my privilege to open the launch of the University of Manchester Office for Open Research. The event has been opened up, so there have been a large number of people we understand from outside the University of Manchester as well, and you're particularly welcome to this event. Just as a heads up, we moved this to a virtual event, not realizing that at least 3 of us are off with either COVID or other coronavirus nasties on the panel. So I'm quite glad that we did in the end. The other benefit, of course, is that we're able to have 100, 200 registrations to an event, which would be difficult for people to travel to Manchester to reach. So you're very, very welcome to this really special moment for us. In terms of the speakers for the event, we've got myself giving a quick sort of context of why we're doing this, then my colleague, Professor Colette Fagan, will be speaking. My colleague from the library, Scott, is the head of the Office for Open Research, will also be talking. We have an esteemed panel this afternoon. Sarah Rui is Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Public Library of Science, and Sarah works to develop new business models for sustainable and open access publishing. Mark Hannell, who's the CEO and founder of Figshare. Mark founded the repository platform Figshare, which provides research data infrastructure for institutions, publishers, and funders globally. And then two further colleagues of mine, Professor Caroline Jay and Professor Carol Goebel from the Department of Computer Science at the University of Manchester. Caroline works to improve software sustainability from both technical and cultural perspectives. And Carol is the co-author of the 2016 FAIR Guiding Principles. So I do hope you enjoy our session this afternoon. This event is being recorded, so just you'll be aware already, no doubt, but you'll be muted and cameras off during the session, but there'll be time for questions after each speaker. I think Scott's correct, is that right? I can see you nodding. Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. So, by way of brief introduction, the library at the University of Manchester has supported open research for well over 10 years through our open access and research data management services. I think it's one of the largest teams in the UK supporting one of the largest universities in the UK. And it's been a really interesting journey that we've all been on in terms of the open access movement for much longer than 10 years. I'm really proud that Manchester has been one of the leading universities in that broader agenda. During that time, the open research movement has evolved and gained momentum to include a much wider range of open research practices. And obviously this has moved us well beyond the original aims of the open access movement into every part of the research lifecycle. And the launch of our Office for Open Research then represents our response to this development and is a reinvention of how we support open research at Manchester. It represents, we hope, a more collaborative and connected approach, with the Office providing a hub for all of the university's activities in this area. And on the right of the slide, you can see our new website. And thanks to everyone who's been involved in a huge amount of work to get that up for today. Thanks, Scott. The Office for Open Research is one of 15 key programme areas in the University Library's Imagine 2030 vision. This can be found online. There's a lot more detail on our website as well. The Imagine 2030 vision is our statement of priorities for one of the country's largest libraries, and is also our response as a library and our contribution to the university's own strategic plan, Our Future. The programme under the Office for Open Research we intend to reinvent our open research support. And it's, as we say here, it's a key part of our vision for a 21st century research library. Following very wide consultation across the university and actually across the sector as well, the programme developed an open research position statement for the university, which myself and Colette released a few months ago, and a 3-year open research strategic action plan. And with that action plan, I'm going to hand over to Scott to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm coming off the subs bench for this bit, as Chris is feeling under the weather, so quite a detailed slide, so I'm stepping in before Colette speaks. So yeah, the action plan that we developed based on all that consultation that Chris talked about produced a 10-point plan, and we have been working through that plan already. I mean, alongside developments to launch the office, we've been making great progress through the plan. And just to get to pause really and just to reflect on what has been achieved, we've developed a strategy and action plan for transitioning away from these big deal subscription journal models. We've produced training and guidance on the responsible use of metrics. We've delivered an open research comms strategy and campaign, of which this event is a part of that campaign. We, as of today, have begun the process of delivering a single access point for all of our open research support through the new Office for Open Research website. And last year we launched Figshare, which, and Mark will speak more about that later on, as our institutional data repository. So there's been lots to look back on over the last year or so and reflect on how much has been achieved. But if we move forward and look towards the second half of the plan, the launch of the Office for Open Research really should put us in a really strong position now to attack some of the more ambitious aspects of the plan. And you can see there that there are projects around improved open research skills training, developing an open research indicator framework and dashboard, which would hopefully allow the university to measure the uptake of relevant open research practices across different disciplines. There's an ambition to create and publicize guidelines, policies and practices for sharing protocol and code under open source licenses. We hope to embed best practice in data management across the university by piloting data stewardship models, and we want to utilize the systems that we subscribe to and develop ourselves to facilitate greater internal collaboration. So there's a huge amount there that we want to achieve, and hopefully with this launch of the office, we're in a much better position to approach these next 5 activities. So I'll just quickly summarize the 4 key functions of the Office for Open Research, which launches today. So the first key function is to strategically coordinate the university's response to the open research agenda. So, you know, puts us in a really good position to, let's say, develop through that second half of the plan. The second key function is to create a single point of contact with the expert open research support already available. Key function 3 is to support open research communities within the university and beyond. And key function 4 is to champion open research and share the latest open research news. So those are the 4 real reasons for the office to be established. And one of the main ways that we hope to achieve those functions is through what we call the Open Research Service Partnership, which is an informal network of the service providers that exist across the university. So we've formed this partnership to really help improve the join up between those parts of the university that provide services, and so it will really help us to provide that single access point, triage inquiries. There'll be one inquiry point for users to use, and we can send those inquiries around the network. It'll position us better to approach projects, and it will help with sharing knowledge. So the Open Research Service Partnership will hopefully help us achieve those key functions of the office. So I will now hand over to Colette. Colette, are you ready to take over?
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm one of the people who, if I get through without coughing, will have done well. But I'm really pleased to be here because this is a fantastic culmination of the first stage of the work. So I am going to start with some thank yous. I really want to thank the library team and my academic colleagues who've been pioneering open research, because what they do is they come forward with great ideas about what we should be doing and, equally important, solutions about how we're going to take them forward. So that makes my job a lot easier. And I will say I'm not an open research expert at all. I've had to learn, as many academics, for my own research, but also in my role as Vice President for Research at Manchester, creating the environment that our colleagues want to work in. So I'm really pleased to acknowledge the work that colleagues have done at Manchester, and also just that I've been impressed with the sector. So I know that Chris and others in the library have been working with our partners in Column, and I know at least UCL's here. I haven't had time to do a name check on who's here, and also our work with N8 as well, both in terms of the live issue around open access publishing costs, where we're making good progress, but the broader open research agenda as well. So great to be here. So if we can move on to the next slide, thank you. Chris talked about how it was central to the university library strategy, and of course in all good organizations it should align with the other elements of the strategy, and it's central to the research strategy that I'm leading for the university. We have 5 key priorities. They're on the website. We'll not go through all of them now, but one of them is about creating an open and responsible research environment. And key elements there are open research practices alongside research ethics and integrity, inclusive team working, and so forth. So it's very much the jigsaw pieces fitting in terms of the activity that the library are driving through and what I need for us to be able to deliver the research strategy that we want to deliver. So I think we can move on. So let me talk you through where all this sits, because as Chris says, it's a partnership and some of this is virtual. And the slide that Scott put up summarising the different elements which come together, well, large parts of those all sit within the research and business engagement team, directed by Andrew Walsh, and which support me in my work, alongside the library, Manchester University Press, and our marketing and comms. So what we do is we bring together the overall governance through the Open Research Strategy Group. You can check the slides after, I'm sure they'll be circulated, but you'll see the representation there drawn from the academic side and the library team that are making all this work, and the research and business engagement support services. So that's where we do the key decision making to help drive and evaluate the progress on the strategy. A key element of that is the UK Reproducibility Network, which is led by Andrew Stewart, who sits on the Open Research Strategy Group, and is really helping us take forward the reproducibility agenda. I think we've got open access publishing nailed at Manchester. We put an excellent service in the library over a number of years, high compliance rates for REF. Colleagues know what to do. We've achieved most of the cultural shift and working practices we need to do there. But reproducibility is a new agenda, very unfamiliar for some, and it means quite different things in different disciplines. So I'm really pleased that Andrew and colleagues stepped up and said, we can help take this forward, rather than me having to become an expert over a weekend about what the university might need in this space. Next slide, please, Scott. Working alongside the Reproducibility Network is the Open Research Action Group, which draws colleagues together, our academics and technical and professional service who are interested in already doing some of this stuff, to help raise our standards, identify policies, think about how we can cascade it out, and bring the more novice, more suspicious, perhaps too busy to get involved at this stage, wider academic community. And Caroline J, who's here today, I'm delighted to see on the panel, is working very closely with Andrew on both the Open Research Action Group and the next slide, please, Scott. Oh, hang on, I've jumped ahead. There's an open research community as well attached to this. So let me get on to my 4 calls for action, as I see Scott getting nervous that I've lost the plot. Okay, Open Research Action Group want to know your ideas and they want people to get involved. Open Research Accelerator Fund to help you do this. And thank you to Research England's QR allocation to enhance our research culture and environment, which we use some of it to support this. It's opening now to help innovate and educate and spread the word. Okay, 3rd action, please. Join the Open Research Network, get involved. Caroline and Andrew are among the leaders in here, and they all feed through their ideas into the action group and then feed through to the Open Research Strategy Group, where we look at resourcing and policing and so forth. And then my 4th call for this activity is we want case studies so that we can show by doing and by example, both within Manchester and the wider community, because this will all be publicly available. I think Scott's gonna, yeah, he's nodding, thank you. So that's what we're doing. It's really exciting. We can't do it without you coming forward with your ideas and getting involved. It will be a shell without your contribution, even if it's a very well-run shell. So I look forward to hearing more about activity in this area as we move forward. And I'll stop now because we've got a panel coming and I think I'm getting a wave anyway. Okay.
Thank you, Colette. So we're now moving into the speaker panel. I'm really delighted to be welcoming our 4 speakers today. We're really grateful that all 4 of you have taken the time out to join us and to share your thoughts on open research. There will be time for questions after each speaker. I'll be managing that through the chat. So if you could put any questions in the chat, we won't be using the raised hands function today. Okay, so with that, we'll go to the first speaker, who's Professor Carol Goebel. And Carol is going to be talking about open science without borders, Manchester leading international communities. So Carol will be talking about Elixir, which is a research infrastructure used in Europe for life sciences. This talk will highlight 2 of Elixir's open science resources built by open science communities to enable life sciences research to be open and led by Manchester. Thank you, Carol.
So thank you very much, Lorraine. I slightly changed my title just to confuse you and keep you on your toes. I'm actually also really going to talk about where Manchester is leading work in open research, but also where Manchester overall can learn from that work in open research. So as you mentioned, there's quite a lot of activity that Manchester already takes part in if I can make my slides move, which they don't seem to be. Here we are. That Manchester's already participating in. So you'll have noticed, no doubt, that there's a tremendous amount of energy right now in open research, data sharing, reuse internationally. The NIH, for example, in the US has just made what is called a seismic mandate that from 2023, all data that's produced by their projects will be shared publicly. You can imagine what quite a stir that has made. This has really been driven over the last, I would say, a few years, since about 2016, by something called the FAIR principles. And I think Mark will probably speak to this later on in more detail. This is the statement that data in particular should be findable, accessible, interoperable, i.e. combinable with other data, and reusable. And so this really has caught the attention of the wider international community at all levels, right from national level, UKRI, through to OECD, through to UNESCO recommendations, and so on. So there's a real drive now into moving open research, data sharing, reuse and FAIR into the mainstream, rather than a kind of community of us that have been working on this for quite some years, but really kind of as almost a pioneering group. Now it becomes mainstream. In Europe, we have the same sort of story in Horizon Europe, our new program, which you can participate in, folks, as UK members. Their publications are expected to be open access. Data sets are supposed to be fair, as I've just suggested that they should be, and open as possible, closed as necessary. And there's a reason for the closed as necessary when one is working with sensitive data. But an important thing here is that in Horizon Europe is very clear that this is not just data, it's also software, algorithms, protocols, computational workflows, models, physical objects as well. And that software, as well as data and publications, shall be a first-class research output as well. Now, to bring that down to something that Manchester's very much involved with in that sort of very wide vision, I wanted to introduce you to something called Elixir. And Elixir is one of these federated intergovernmental organizations that's trying to enable open science, and in this particular case, in the life sciences. But there are around 50 of these research infrastructures in Europe. This one is particular about life science data. And it's really driving the agenda of fair and open data and software in the life sciences, dealing with sensitive data, which has to be closed sometimes. And it leads the activities, for example, in Europe's fight against COVID and the running of the European COVID-19 data portal. Now, this is 23 national nodes and the European Bioinformatics Institute, 300 organizations all cooperating around open research and open science. Elixir UK is the national node that's made up of 22 UK organizations in its own right. And Manchester was one of the founding organizations there of Elixir Europe and of Elixir UK. And I'm the joint head of node based in Manchester. The other head of node is based in Earlham Institute. So we have been working together for the last, 10, 15 years in this collective in trying to build open research environments, very much based around the notion of teams. So we have a plethora of teams operating in Elixir, operating across all of these different nations, across all of these different organizations, collaborating and cooperating. And I think the framing of research as a competition is not useful. And we've seen that in the COVID activities. Really, research is a collaboration and a cooperation. This gives some idea of the interconnectedness of all of our international nodes working together. And we've all been working together virtually throughout the COVID situation. So I wanted to really show how this really works, how open research really works, with two specific concrete examples from this collaboration, both of them multi-site team-led, both of them led by Manchester in partnership with VIB in Ghent, but with a great number of other collaborators building open community collaborations. One's called Workflow Hub and the other's called the RDM Kit. So Workflow Hub is a hub for workflows. Workflow is a computational pipeline. So it's a way, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's a series of steps wired together into a multi-step pipeline. And each of those steps is a piece of software code. So this is really a special kind of software registry. And it's really expressing how do you create a multi-step processing pipeline. So it's really about the sharing and reuse of method, not just data, but of how you did something. Where did the data come from? We importantly raise the issue here of author visibility and credit. So not only can you share these computational pipelines, as indeed this one, this is a particularly important one. It's part of the COVID collection of the European COVID data portal, and some of these have been viewed over 3,000 times. You also get credit. You can also have a DOI associated with these. You can publish them. They also present process transparency and reproducibility. And as you just mentioned, Colette, reproducibility is one of our key agenda items that we have to deal with. We have special support within these registries for building support for living content, that's the software, support for pre-existing systems because we're not living in a greenfield site, and support for teams of people. And this was really built up really quickly. We launched it 6 months into 2020 to meet the COVID sharing needs. And I really wanted to show that there's multiple ways of thinking about open research. And here Workflow Hub illustrates 4 different ways. The first, it's built on an open software platform that has been co-developed over the last decade with many different partners in Germany, in Belgium, in Norway, led by Manchester. So we were able to build on open source software. So we could share our developments. We have sustainability because we're able to share our developments, and we were able to rapidly boot up this registry. The second is it is built using open development techniques. So that's shared open perpetual development with hackathons, with different teams being able to contribute features, again, sharing a sustainability burden. And we have a club of around 40 regular members from about 15 different organizations who collectively work with us to build it. It's built to work in an open ecosystem. That means that it doesn't expect to be the only system. It has to work with different types of software, has to work with different kinds of services, it has to work with different kinds of notebooks. It has to work with different kinds of repositories, for example, Figshare, which I thoughtfully put in for Mark. And finally, then it has open content within it, all these different computational processes that you're able to register yours and showcase your research, demonstrate how your processing works in order to defend the reproducibility of your data, but also then for that to be reused by many other researchers, again, with the credit and attribution that, that you should have for anything that is a scholarly output. The second example is something called the Research Data Management Toolkit, or RDM Kit. And this is a web-based toolkit for bioscientists and their data stewards that offers guidance on research data management. And this is about sharing and reuse of knowledge and know-how. If I'm asked to do a data management plan, how do I go about it? With the detail needed as a bioscientist, not at the sort of most general levels of simple metadata, but how do I really do that if I have to deal with plant data, or I have to do with epigenetic data, or bioimaging data. And this again has been built by over 125 people working together, launched and developed entirely in lockdown, built in just 1 year. And again, contributor visibility and credit is paramount. I can't speak, guys. I've got COVID just like everybody else. And it's affecting my ability to speak as much as my brain. So again, we can see exactly the same sort of pattern. It's built on open software. It's built using open development techniques. It's built to work in an open ecosystem, linking to registries of tools and registries of training materials and registries of data management plans and different techniques for being able to make your data fair, in order to be able to create an environment where you have fair open content, which enables open research. So this kind of 4 layers is different kinds of ways that we can see open research actually being put in practice. When we're building these kind of communities to work together, and there we have hundreds of people working together across national boundaries in many different organizations, it's helpful to really think about how one does open research, collaboration, cultivation. And there's this kind of healthy community checklist, which we've used in both of those cases, which we've extended, that sort of sets out how you go about building a team that really will work and will be sustained. And I won't go into the details of that, but I really wanted to kind of get across to folks that Manchester's leading these activities. What benefits have we got? Well, we have the benefits, of course, of being able to build systems where people can share and reuse results. In this case, it's computational workflows or software. And Caroline will mention more about software sharing in her talk next, but also about the importance of credit and visibility of that open research. So just because it's open doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. One has to respect the credit and the citations and respect those who have contributed. But also for me, it's been tremendously important for the opportunities of collaboration. We were able to, with these collaborations, rapidly develop and also get sustainability support for these environments. And you get tremendous scalable snowball effects by working openly and collaboratively. You're involved in more projects, you're involved in more activities, and so you do even more. And I get by with a little help from my friends here, because particularly in our situation of funding at the moment with Europe, I'm in 7 Horizon Europe projects that have been funded because I worked collaboratively and openly with all of my colleagues. And when the push came to shove, they were there to help us and to keep these things going and to make sure that we continued our research. My last couple of slides, I wanted to point out that really this is all grounded on research software engineers and data stewards. These are the folks who have enabled the building of these platforms. Research software engineers also bring the open development practices that's common in software to actually how we do open research altogether, how we built and coordinated our communities. And our data stewards really bring the processes and methodologies in order to be able to understand how to share resources so that they can be reused by others. And so they're absolutely essential to innovating, developing, and operating our digital infrastructures that are totally necessary for open research. And they are equally respected in research teams. And Caroline will talk later about research software engineers. The names you list here are all the research software engineers that work in my eScience lab. So how will we bring all these open research practices that I hope I've excited you about in Elixir into Manchester? Well, through the Office of Open Research, that's how. And already we have, for example, the Workflow Hub example that I mentioned is illustrated as a use case. So for that, I'd like to acknowledge all these people who've contributed to this work and this basket of funders who have also contributed. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's really exciting to see the growth of open research tools and infrastructure. So we've got about 5 minutes now for questions. So we've got a question here in the chat from Fred Breeze. How can a broad base of users be encouraged to engage with developments such as Workflow Hub, especially if they're not highly engaged with the broader open research movement?
So that's 2 aspects, isn't it, Lorraine? Now, I think the first is how to actually get involved in that particular resource, and that's easy. You join the Workflow Hub Club, and you're off. But I think that this is then the bigger picture. I think is the how do we create the appropriate environment so that people can work together, can collaborate. And that's where I was kind of speaking towards how one puts together communities and how one thinks about communities. And it doesn't just happen. You have to really carefully design your communities so that they are open and one does get democratic processes and one is actually respected when one works together. And that's why I put up that little kind of checklist. there. So I think one of the things that we should do in Manchester in our new open research office is really think, how do we disseminate those kinds of practices and enable people to set up their own communities around their own research that follow those best practices, and give people the benefit of those experiences that have been born out of hard work and making mistakes, actually. So, so I think that's partly an answer.
Thank you. Any other questions for Carol? I had one which was, did you perceive, Carol, that there are still some barriers that we need to overcome with regard to adoption of open research tools and infrastructure?
Yes, the barrier, I think, is there's two big barriers, really. The first is the sustainability of infrastructure. That you really, if you're asking people to change their practices, then they need to be convinced that the infrastructure that they need is in place, and it will still be there when they do that. You can't suddenly shift the ground. So you can't say, well, okay, now you have to put all of your data in this repository. Oh, we've decided to take away the repository. You really need to create a stable environment that people can be guaranteed will still be there in order to be able to support their practices, because you're asking them to change their practices. The second thing is you have to give people time, and you have to give people the skills to be able to adopt these processes, and you have to give people the reward, the credit. It has to be recognized, I think. Otherwise, it's labor for no gain, because you are effectively asking people to work cooperatively in a pool. And so it's good if people have given the opportunity to do that. So that means creating the time and the space to do it, that they've got the capability to do it, so they have the skills, or they can turn to the skills like sufficient data stewards or research software engineers who can help them, and also that there is actually got an immediate return for them, as well as the long-term promise of better science and better research, and more collaborations and so on. So I think those are the things that we really need to think about. You can't just assert policy. You have to also create the environment so that policy can actually be adopted.
Okay, thank you, Carol. So there's a question from Chris. It's great to see so much European activity. And as you know, Manchester has key strategic partnerships with Toronto and Melbourne. Might there be an opportunity for us to develop an OA agenda there too?
Yes, in fact, both of the systems that I presented there, Chris, are partnered with the Australian Biocommons. Actually, the Australians are particularly active in this field. Again, the NIH, for example, is taking up the Research Data Management Toolkit. So these things have no boundaries. One doesn't do research in a Manchester box or a UK box or a European box. You do research globally. So I think we can certainly develop these ideas with our strategic partners. I think there are also many researchers like myself who have many other kind of strategic partnerships. And I think it would be useful for Manchester to really look at those kind of almost grassroots or project developed strategic partnerships that aren't named as strategic partnerships at the institutional level, but turn out to be strategic partnerships at the sort of community or departmental or research group level.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question from Alexandra Roberts from Swansea University. Congratulations on the launch of the office, thank you. And there is a lot of talk about communities. Are the activities of the new office considered part of Manchester University's civic mission?
I leave that question to Colette.
Not explicitly. I think that's probably diluting the civic engagement strategy. But clearly, the more open we are, there are fewer borders for people outside of a university to make use of and engage with our research, but it's not an explicit part of our civic engagement, which is much more about building industry collaborations, educational partnerships, opening our cultural institutions to better use and so forth. Full details are on the social responsibility part of our website if you search on civic engagement.
I had a quick thing, Colette, if it's okay. From the library's perspective, when we were designing Imagine 2030, Alexandra, thank you for the question. The University Sustainable Goals, you may know, plug alert, that Manchester is actually ranked first in the world by Times Higher Education Supplement in terms of the UN Sustainable Goals. There's 17 of those, and one of those is engaging with, as Colette says, with cultural institutions and the libraries. And in that sustainable goal, we're also ranked first in the world. And I think part of the vision around the libraries Imagine 2030, and very much the libraries work within the office, it is, as Colette says, very outward looking, beyond the academy. And I hope that, you know, even going back 20 years, some of the founding visions for the open access movement were really around social impact as much as academic access. So not explicitly as Colette says, but certainly in terms of the ethos of the office and what Manchester believes its role is in wider society, then the office is certainly, yeah, absolutely part of our mission in those terms, isn't it, Colette?
Thanks, Chris, for elaborating. Much more neat.
Okay, I
think, sorry, Lorraine, I was going to also follow up to Fred's question. Now I've seen it in more detail in the chat. I think there's also a role here for the office, which is a kind of awareness raising role, which I think Scott already mentioned, but also a championing role. Okay, which is, okay, I've seen something now that I can be part of, for example, say Workflow Hub or RDM Kit or so on. How do I go about really joining in? And if we can have a sort of one spot where folks can say, we have a champion for that resource, and we can put you in touch with the Manchester champion, that's a really direct way of being able to get folks to engage. So I think there's an important brokering activity here that the office can actually develop, and it has to do that with the members of Manchester. So because, you know, not a few people in the library can do that, it won't scale, but the library can know who to contact. And by keeping such a sort of registry of champions, we can scale it out. And it's a lot easier to have a bioscientist championing to bioscientists than it is to have somebody in perhaps the library doing a whole bunch of different activities championing to bioscientists. So, and I know, for example, that one of my team members, Manazan Andrabi, has been working in that field. So that's something I think the office should really do, and it will do, I think.
And time for one final question, which is from John Warren. How do we embed these tools, processes and ethos into our taught programmes here at Manchester in UKHEI so that our undergraduates, postgraduates and PGR experience and grow into this environment? Excellent question. Again, I think this is actually where we should also think about not just the research life cycle activities, but the student life cycle activities as well. So we really need to think about this holistically. What are the areas, the nudge points that we can see that we can introduce these kinds of resources, these champions, these activities at each point in our research student life cycle, but also when we onboard our our researchers, when we're creating communities of practice in the university. So I think we do a lot of things in the university
rather than adding yet another lot of things, I think looking for the points of nudge within those current structures, and seeing where could we introduce open research know-how would be particularly valuable, if you see what I mean, Lorraine.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Carol. And just one final comment there from Chris, pointing out that Paul Ayres from UCL is on the call as well, and Manchester and UCL libraries are working very close together in this field.
Lorraine, could I just add to Carol's point about embedding in curriculum? So we've already got some of this going on, because the wide community of academics who are already doing this stuff are doing it in their teaching as well as research. And Caroline and Andrew have got more of an oversight of how this lands. We'll be beefing up the training and development options that we offer to our early career researchers. Some of them don't need it, they're the ones who are teaching us, but in some subject areas, we need to spread out the good practice, or perhaps get that dialogue between what it means in bioscience compared to history, for example. So there are things afoot in the university already, and we'll continue to build on those. Thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah, I think Colette's, that's right. We have a lot of grassroots activities we should be leveraging. We have, as you say, curriculums already being developed. I think perhaps, Colette, the people that we really need to train are perhaps not the junior staff. I think it's the senior staff who we have to, not necessarily that we expect to train them in the details of data management practice for their own hands to do, but that they need to understand the importance of this and why their team members, their researchers, their postdocs, their PhD students need to be given the time and the space in order to be able to do this.
Carol, agree. I'm on it. I'd like to be able to say I've mastered it or mistressed it, but I haven't yet. But it is part of our strategy of how we build forward.
Okay. It just remains for me to say thanks very much, Carol, for that really thought-provoking talk. And we'll move on now to our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Ruhi. Sarah is Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS, which is the Public Library of Science. Sarah works to develop new business models for sustainable and inclusive open access publishing, and will be speaking about challenges in moving towards a more equitable and open publishing landscape. The title of her talk is "It Matters How We Open Science, a discussion of equity in the context of scholarly communications." Thank you, Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay and see my slide deck and hopefully not my notes? Does that all look good? Great. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. Congratulations again to the University of Manchester on your new Office of Open Research. I'm delighted to be invited and sort of zoom out. I really enjoyed listening to Carol's talk. I think there's a lot of overlap between the kind of questions that we need to think about with respect to equity and the kinds of questions we think about when thinking about continuing to open science by open research. So there's a lot I'm going to try to cover. I'm going to try and do it quickly. So if we can't get to everything, hopefully we can have more conversations. But one of the key aspects of thinking about equity is acknowledging the communities you belong to. And certainly PLOS as my home, as my employer, is one such community. And we've been around for quite a while as an open access publisher. We have 12 titles that are currently our primary vehicles for facilitating the increased adoption and dissemination of open science practices, exactly the kinds of things Carol and other speakers on this presentation have discussed. Again, journals are the places where communities come together. The open science practices are really where we extend beyond those communities to ensure that any person needing and wanting to access any aspect of the research life cycle can. We also do a bunch of research on open science adoption, and I've shared a link there. So this is kind of the place where PLOS starts with respect to open research, but there's a lot more to sort of think about beyond that. So this is kind of the journey I want to go on in the next 10 minutes or so. We'll see how far we can get, but I think there'll be a lot to discuss and to share. So I am a social scientist by training, so I like to get my terms straight, my vocabulary straight. So I like to sort of reflect on what we mean by open. And I think the Manchester position statement on open research does a really nice job with this. The practice of applying principles of transparency and rigor to as many stages of the research life cycle. I think it's a good distillation of UNESCO's open science recommendation that was adopted last year. It's a slightly more highfalutin definition, but I think speaks to the scope of what we're trying to achieve in looking at movements and practices that make knowledge available, accessible, and reusable to better society. One of the challenges with this is making that very heady concept a little bit more accessible. And certainly at PLOS, we define open as it's more about being able to read or share a research object. It's about the context to understand it so that others, particularly those outside of the scholarly communications ecosystem, can understand it, benefit from it, and use it. So another definition to think about. But the challenge is, how do we make this real? And I think Carol's work really speaks to really nice concrete examples of how we can make it real. But I think when we're reflecting on, big paradigm shifting experiences like a global pandemic, like climate change, and like really ambitious efforts like open science, they can feel very heady in the sense that, what can I as any one person do to really move the needle on something like equity and scholarly communications? And so one of the things that I like to ground in, and I think this applies to your approach to open science practices or your approach to thinking about equity in the context of open science, is really to start with one's orientation and context first. So it's very tempting to start at the national or transnational level. UNESCO it's a huge deal to have them make a recommendation of the kind that they did, but that's hard to wrap your head around. Even at the institutional level, it's huge that Manchester has an office for open science that they're opening, but again, that can feel a little big. Even the communities close to us where we engage can feel big. I know when PLOS was really addressing these questions around equity in 2019 and 2020, the idea of like, wow, how do we make substantive change was a very big lift. And so often what I recommend is, if you can, for the moment, turn off those lenses and focus on yourself as the individual. Start there by asking the classic sort of question of, where do I sit myself as a participant in scholarly communication? And I'm riffing here on that idea of you only know where you stand based on where you sit. And that's going to be kind of a thread through this presentation. So as with all of these discussions, they do begin with a certain amount of self-reflection, which is, again, it's not about assigning blame, judgment, anything like that. It's about bringing an intentionality to how you experience your work with colleagues in the communities where you work. And that can be as broad as, what does it mean to be a participant in open science, all the way down to, what is my experience in a lab, in my group in the library, in the Office of Open Research. So trying to make this concrete for yourself. The first really sort of obvious question is just, how does my packaging as a human in this world inform how I see the world and my work, right? And it's very tempting to drop into identity buckets here, race, gender, ethnicity, those sorts of things. But there's a broader question, right? What is my educational background? Where did I grow up? What language do I speak, right? These are all questions that inform my experience of the communities that I engage with. And once I'm conscious of those, I can start picking at what assumptions ground that worldview. And it's very interesting for me as a humanities social science person coming into STEM, I'm always very struck by the assumptions that undergird what folks trained almost exclusively in STEM think about around how knowledge is created, how knowledge is disseminated, what constitutes good knowledge, right? There's a lot in there that if we're not unpacking to acknowledge, we can miss and then consequently sort of generate outcomes that maybe we didn't want. And PLOS is actually quite implicated in that, which I'll talk in a little bit later about. So then I can think about, well, what things have always been easy for me and what things have always been more difficult. And again, to use a non-charged identity example, I've always had a pretty easy time getting in front of a group and talking. And this has always seemed to me to be a pretty easy and fun thing to do. And the vast majority of people do not have that experience. And if I can stop to reflect on that for a second, it informs how I engage with other people who are perhaps struggling to give presentations or struggling to communicate in more public settings, right? So again, this idea of where do I sit falls into a lot of different buckets, not just the kind of very charged ones we're talking about right now. And so just to give examples, these are all pieces that I tend to reflect on when I'm looking at questions of equity in scholarly communications. A woman of color, biracial immigrant, child of parents of highly educated parents, but a dropout myself, very specific understanding of epistemology based on a strong grounding in social sciences with very little aptitude for the hard sciences, and a very specific role that I've always played in the context of publishing that has nothing to do has far less to do with the day-to-day editorial work of a publisher. And that informs how I move in scholarly publishing communities. And so this kind of level of reflection, I think, is a useful place to start. And then once you do that, and you'll have to forgive the political theorist in me can't resist sort of getting into this space. Once you know where you sit, you can start to have honest discussions with yourself and your communities around your relationships to power and the power structures that drive how we work. I mean, one of the points Carol made, I think that's really powerful is, open science, open research adoption is not going to happen out of the goodness of our hearts. I mean, it does with some folks, but the vast majority of us need to be incentivized to engage in those kinds of practices. That's a power dynamic. That's a powerful power dynamic. And recognizing that we can motivate different behaviors by shifting power incentives is a critical component of increasing open research adoption. So again, not thinking about blame, but more thinking about opportunities for change. So when you think about power, the originalist theorists of power, and there's a very large stable of old white men who thought about this, they were thinking about it in the context of the use of force or coercion and the fact that, communities find it very hard to live together if those things aren't controlled, right? So that's a very kind of gross definition of power that reflects the time in which these men were thinking. As we kind of move into the 20th century, move past certainly the horrors of World War II, we get a new sort of school of theorists who are thinking of power less in terms of force and coercion and more in terms of systems, right? What are the systems, largely invisible, around us that cage us, for lack of a better word? And of course, Michel Foucault's panopticon is the very famous example of that, but certainly Hannah Arendt's reflections on power systems within totalitarianism is very powerful. As you move beyond that, particularly after the second wave of feminism into the present, and we particularly look at feminist theory, we're starting to look at theorists who are thinking about power in the context of the individual experience, and how does the disempowered person, whether that be a woman, whether that be a woman of color, whether that be a specially abled person, whether that be a non-native English speaker, again, it depends on the context, who those underrepresented groups are. We can start to think about where we fit in those contexts and how we shift them, right? So these are very much theorists in the, grounded in the humanities and social sciences, but pulling these sorts of thought into our work around open science can really inform how we think about it. And the cool thing, I was actually very excited when I was prepping for this conversation, is how many researchers are doing that now, particularly in the context post-COVID. You don't need to start at COVID to recognize health inequities, certainly in the US with respect to communities of color. But the fact that there are really thoughtful researchers like Dr. Boleg and other who are actually thinking about, well, how do we actually look at the systems we use to study health inequities and recognize the power structures built within them, which is very interesting, super problematic, but pushes us to think about assumptions that we have from where we sit that are going to be very different from the perspective of a Black woman thinking about health equity. Another take on this that I'll jump to is a fantastic piece of research by folks out of Liverpool Hospital. And again, I never thought I'd see the day where a bunch of health policy folks are looking at Marxist definitions of power, but this glossary of theories for understanding power and policy and health equity was a really interesting take of public health experts thinking about power as a central force within the creation and maintenance of policy, which seems very obvious, but takes a minute to kind of sink in. So if you look at their definitions, they're saying, you know, articulating the architecture of power within policy institutions is an important step in understanding dynamics, actions, and decisions, especially those that create health inequities. If you remove any language around health or policy, we are talking about architectures that apply to any group or community that we engage in, whether that is as a reviewer of a journal, as a contributor to a lab, as a collaborator on a paper, as a librarian in a certain part of the library, as a university leader in an office of research. Which then kind of brings us to the question of, okay, if we're willing to engage in that self-reflection, to understand our proximity and interaction with systems of power, then what are we trying to do with that knowledge? How do we address it? And that's where we get to the question of equity and what equity actually is. So it's worth taking a minute to define this term again, just to go back to shared definitions. Equity gets thrown around now. It's the buzzword everybody wants to talk about, but what does it actually mean? And I like to turn to a framing of equity versus equality that is very common in the early childhood education research space. And illustrations are always kind of a good way of making these things clear. So I like to use illustrations. This one from the Interaction Institute for Social Change. Basically, when you're thinking about equality, you're saying, let's just make sure that the experience that everyone has is the same, right? Without really looking at where an individual sits when they're coming into that experience, right? So I don't know if any of you have had lately the pleasure of trying to submit a paper to any system. The PLOS journal submission system is a real journey that requires patience and a tremendous amount of sugar to get through. If you are a non-native English speaker trying to go through a submission system, it is a real exciting and stressful and difficult undertaking, right? But the assumption is, well, English is the language of science. Of course, every submission platform is going to be in English. PLOS certainly is. So if you're having a hard time, like that's on you. You need to figure out how to deal with submitting in English when you're not a native English speaker. So that's a nice example of kind of the difference between equity and equality. So if you take the belabored metaphor that the cricket match, the baseball game, the football match that we're all trying to watch is scientific knowledge creation and dissemination via open research. You take the fence as any barrier. The gentleman on the left is kind of your typical well-funded researcher based in a Western country who speaks English, who's educated entirely in a Western paradigm, who has never seen a fence. The fence doesn't exist to them. They participate with ease. And then as you go down the line, you have more and more researchers and types of knowledge creation that simply barely get over the fence or can't get over the fence at all. And so what equity is about systemic change to ensure that regardless of where you sit, you can have the same experiencer as the tall man who doesn't really need a box under his feet, such that everyone can have the same experience acknowledging where they're starting from. And this is really the point, I think, where open science is at right now that's really exciting, because we are at a turning point where we can keep doing what we're doing on the left side of the screen and just apply it to open science as opposed to something like open access. Or we can start thinking about the right side of the screen and looking at how are we embedding open science practices such that we are addressing some of these issues in a meaningful way. And so the question becomes, how do we start to dismantle the fence, acknowledging if you agree that the fence exists? And the first question really to ask is, what are the dominant social groups in the communities in which we engage, and who are they? This may be, what is the diversity of a given lab or a given office in a university setting? What is the diversity of my local group I volunteer in, right? These questions can be applied to any kind of community. By extrapolation, who is missing? What is missing? This can be hard to do because there's a lot of blind spots around this kind of question. And then what are the costs of inclusion versus exclusion? And this is I say that, I ask that question in good faith, because when institutions are thoughtful about this, the decision to exclude can be very intentional and very understandable. And the decision to include can also be more thoughtful. So again, a non-charged example I like to give of this is kind of a conference experience pre and post COVID, right? Pre-COVID, we love conferences in person. We got a tremendous out of them in terms of interpersonal engagement that is not sitting watching a talk. And we lost that during COVID. And that was, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've really felt the loss of that in-person experience. However, we did learn that, holy cow, when you make conferences virtual and you actually try to acknowledge time zones, you suddenly have representation from around the globe, folks who would never make it to the conference in person, folks from a number of different career stages who would never be able to attend because they're graduate students and they can't travel. And so now that we are moving into a space of, look, are we going to make conferences in person again? There's a real inclusion exclusion question to ask, which is, do we go back in person entirely and lose that digital inclusion that virtual announces? Do we go the other direction, stay online, lose that really important interpersonal connection? Do we try to go hybrid and do both, which is incredibly expensive and hard to do in a way that actually gives both communities a good experience? That's a genuine question to ask. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in most cases, but that is a thoughtful, intentional conclusion you're coming to. And in so doing, you're hopefully, again, more aware of the blind spots. And if you're not, and I don't have a ton of time to go into this because I made my presentation too long, you risk the broken science trap. And if you're not familiar with broken science, feel free to look for the hashtag on Twitter or Google it. I've shared a bunch of notes about it subsequently. But this is a really, what that is kind of the consequence of having a socially dominant group basically yelling at the rest of the community as to what the mission should be in any given area, in this case, open science, which leads to a sort of bro-y culture that's very both toxic and exclusionary. So not enough time to get into that, but an interesting example of how this works in reality. So I'm going to jump through this very painful Twitter thread, which I encourage you to read sometime, around where this term came from, and start moving into recommendations. So there's definitely a two-pronged approach one can take when thinking about this work in the context of the work that we do. Certainly starting with data, looking at the data that you have for the communities that you engage with and how representative they are, understanding what you're missing and what are your baselines against how to measure. Obviously, anything that's identity related has privacy issues tied to it. So thoughtfully gathering data in a way that's appropriate is really important. And then what are the low hanging versus heavier structural lifts, right? The opportunistic things, for example, are, if conferences are keeping a virtual component, get those students, get those researchers who never have the funding to travel, and encourage them to participate, because the conference is making that possible. Heavier structural lifts, like why is it that a certain demographic is always getting tenure and it's not a very diverse group? That's a much bigger conversation that involves more people. And that is something that an organization has to take time to address, because it's both complex and expensive. And there's a number of things that I linked to within the presentation here to provide resources on how to do that kind of thing. And so I'll just end with an example from PLOS. As I say, no one is outside of these systems of power and knowledge. None of us is, all of us have contributed to building that fence in some way. Many of us have benefited from that fence, consciously or unconsciously. So any work to undo some of that has to be grounded in accountability. And I'm a big fan of using PLOS as an example. Our business models and mostly our business models, but certainly in other ways, had a lot of blind spots where we made a lot of assumptions when we first launched in the early 2000s around why our models were great, why they would work for everyone. And we didn't realize the unintended consequences of some of that. And so as a result, we've very earnestly and publicly committed to a set of changes. And this involved leadership from the executive level all the way down in terms of deciding where we were going to focus, how we were going to do the work within each of these 4 key areas, what the metrics were going to be for success versus areas for improvement, and then very public updates to our communities to hold ourselves accountable, whether we're actually doing the work. So these are all things, again, any group can do, whether it's a lab, whether it's the entire institution. But obviously, as communities get bigger, it becomes a little more unwieldy. You don't have to read these, but these were specific goals that we articulated around diversity, equity, and inclusion that we are reporting on. And any organization, any group that wants to do this work in an earnest way, it's that public accountability that is going to be critical to making the work substantive and not just a talking point that you can point to that isn't actually generating change. And with that, I'm way over. Scott, I'm so sorry. I tried to keep it shorter, but I reference a ton of stuff in here. It is obviously not in alphabetical order. It is in the order that I kind of covered those things within the presentation. I've done a little bit of thinking of this on my own, so I am just more than happy to take questions. And again, congrats to University of Manchester on the big opening.
Thank you, Sarah. That was some really fascinating insight into equity and inclusion considerations as we develop our Office for Open Research. Certainly there's a lot for us to reflect on there. There's a couple of comments in the chat about making sure that in future all of our events and conferences are accessible and as open as they possibly can be. And I had a question as well, which was around what do you think is the place for transformative agreements in future open access publishing? That's quite a big question.
No, that's a really good, I have a lot of thoughts on this. It's a really good question. And I think one of the interesting things about reflecting on the unintended consequence of transformative agreements is what caused them, right? I mean, if you look at and I'm a big fan of Plan S and appreciate what those funders are trying to do. But when you reflect on, the stipulations that they've made for compliance, you get transformative agreements, and transformative agreements are kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a mandate that has a timeline. And as a consequence, don't really allow for some of this reflection. So one of the things that I think comes to mind, for example, is transformative agreements may actually have the unintended effect of just cementing APCs and gold open access as the predominant form of making content open. And that is arguably the most exclusionary way to make content open for a vast majority of the globe that can't and should not have to pay to publish, right? We've just erected, and PLOS is implicated in this, we've erected a new barrier so everyone can read, but if you want to publish, you need to spend thousands of dollars. That could be an unintended consequences of all of these transformative agreements, because that's the quickest and easiest way to get us to the outcome that makes us compliant, which takes us back to Carol's point of if everything is motivated by sticks, and there's not a lot of time to reflect on carrots for why we should engage in these practices, you can end up with a lot of unintended consequences. And so that for me is one of the biggest concerns I have with transformative agreements is it's a panic stress response to a deadline. And there are going to be a lot of unintended consequences that we haven't really had time to unpack. And unfortunately, it depends on the publisher and it depends on the funder, but the various levels of concern about those intended consequences really differ depending on the community there. So that's a very interesting case of a group wielding a lot of power, like those Plan S funders, intending very positive outcomes through their use of power, but perhaps not, needing more time to reflect on the consequence of that particular kind of use of power.
And I think that's reflected in Chris's question as well, which is, should we adopt a more disruptive position as an open access community to allow more publishing as well as more reading?
Like to say this, I mean, I it's funny, I come to this with something of a firebrand view, but then I'm pragmatic too. I mean, I've worked with many of your libraries around figuring out your participation in PLOS's models, for which we're tremendously grateful for your partnership. And there are the realities of taking a more extreme view and acknowledging the limitations that puts on you, on your researchers, while at the same time putting forth putting a stake in the ground for the community. I mean, I think University of California did this when they didn't renew with Elsevier and then issued new models that were extremely staking a claim around, what is the best way to do inclusive participation in Gold OA. So I think it's kind of a practical question. And, libraries have always been pragmatists, right? You have limited budgets. You have a lot of conflicting communities that need your support. So I recognize it is a huge privilege to be able to stake a more extreme position in the spirit of moving the Overton window. And I just think when you make that, should any community make that kind of more strident position, just being aware of the privilege that comes with that is important.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So we'll move on now to our third speaker, who is Professor Caroline Jay. Caroline is Professor of Computer Science and Research Director of the Software Sustainability Institute. Caroline will be describing the University of Manchester's pioneering support for researchers who code, in particular through the Software Sustainability Institute and the Research IT, and explains how software will increasingly underpin our future ability to perform world-leading research. Her title is Made in Manchester, Leading the Way in Software Sustainability. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. So hopefully everyone can see the right version of my slides. I have to say I really enjoyed the last two talks, and I have some reflections actually which I'll try to incorporate into my talk as well. So the first thing I want to say is, so Carol obviously gave us this brilliant international perspective on a lot of the work that Manchester's doing, and I'm going to give more of a sort of grassroots perspective. And so when I say software, what I mean is not just very large scale, say, computational models, climate simulations, this kind of thing, which we often think about as research software, but the R scripts or the Python scripts we might use to analyze data, or the Excel macros that we might use. All of this is software that we use for research. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. So I also probably ought to pose the question as well, what do we mean by software sustainability? So some people who are watching will be very familiar with this term, and probably others won't have heard of it before. So what I'm going to try to do with the talk is explain what software sustainability is, give you a bit of insight into that, and also talk about why it's important as well. And I will do this through an example. So the Britain Breathing Project, which is founded and led by Sheena Cruikshank, who you can see here talking to New Scientist Live, is an app. It's a citizen science project which uses an app to allow people to log information about the hay fever symptoms that they are experiencing. So one of the things that we know is hay fever is increasing over time, as all allergies are, and we're interested in trying to understand why that is. So we allow people to monitor their symptoms on the app, and they do this by saying how they're feeling. So you see on the left here, you choose one of the faces to show how you're feeling, and then you report the symptoms that you'll have for your nose and eyes and breathing and so on. So people submit this data to us, and they can use it to monitor their own symptoms over time. But of course, we're interested as researchers in trying to understand more about allergies. And here are three maps you can see that was sort of the first year of results that we had. We were looking at all these data points on the maps, and the blue ones on the left are people who are feeling fine at the moment, so they've got a smiley face. And then we've got yellow dots here where people are feeling a bit ropey but not too bad. And then we've got the red dots at the moment on the right hand side. So this is where people are reporting severe symptoms. And what we noticed when we looked at these three maps just visually is that whilst you've got a reasonable spread of these dots sort of across the country, with the red dots, they seemed to be concentrated in urban areas. So we were interested in trying to see whether there was a relationship between where people lived and whether people were more likely to report severe symptoms in cities. Okay, so we have got the information from the app. We have got a timestamp from the app as well. So we know when the symptoms were reported. We've got location data from the app. So we know where people were when they reported the symptoms. So what we probably need to do at this point is just cross-check it with information about the environment where they report from. So pollen data, we need that. We need to have some air quality data as well, pollution data. We think that's likely to be a factor. And we probably should include weather data as well, because the weather obviously influences the environment and things like pollen and air quality and so on as well. Okay, so far so good. So I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, don't worry. I'm just using it to illustrate the multitude of variables that we have to deal with here. So we've got lots of pollutants here. These are reported hourly. These are formatted in one particular way. They're available in one way from the web, which is quite a complicated API. Then we've got a different API and different set of data for pollen and meteorological data. And these are reported daily or hourly or somewhere in between, and a different form of access. And then we've got land use categories, which are rural and urban, and these completely different format again. And so all of this data is all over the place, basically. So we've got our set of data from the app, but actually when we try to sort of map it to the environmental variables, it suddenly gets much more complicated. So to get there, we have to download the data in various ways. We check for spurious values, of which there are quite a few. We impute missing values using appropriate algorithms. We then calculate the daily mean and max, which we thought was most useful for our purposes. And then we test the extraction methods and the transformation methods and the imputation methods as well. And this all takes a really long time. It takes weeks and weeks of work. So what we thought we'd do is, as well as using the data ourselves, and this is very widely used data, and lots of researchers use this data, we thought, well, we'll make our data open too. So do note with this that all of this data is technically open. Okay, so it's data that comes from other sources, and it sort of ticks that box of being openly available data. But it's not really fair. So Carol was talking about the FAIR principles in her talk, and it's pretty difficult to find unless you know what you're looking for, and it's not very accessible even before you get to the second two. So what we thought we'd do is we'd release the data sets. We've also, to make it more findable, put a data descriptor paper into Nature Scientific Data. So this just kind of makes it, people can search for it more easily. They can obviously find it on Zenodo. We describe it there with metadata. And we also, crucially, make the software that underpins all of this process available as well. So, it takes a really long time to get to this point. So what we want to do is not just make the data available, but for other people who might want a different year. Okay, so we've got 2016, 2019, or they might want different values each day or whatever. So they can go away and they can modify our software and they can still skip the sort of heavy lifting and use our data to download, use our software to download their own data sets. Okay, so the headline of the results of our research, which I'll just give you quickly, is that symptoms are indeed more severe in urban areas. Why? Is a bit of a work in progress, which we are still working on, so watch this space. But of course, that's not the take-home message of this particular talk. So really the important thing that I want to sort of stress here is something that's sort of implicit and latent in a lot of science now, but it's sort of often not articulated, which is how important software is. So when we think about research, we focus on the story, okay, the narrative, the context in which we interpret our results, think about their implications, and this typically lives in publications. In fact, the method and the results, as Carol was saying, are in the software. And so the science actually happens at the intersection of these two. So the software contains a lot of the science. And of course, it's not just science. Research from many domains is increasingly relying on software in this way. So it was not just the story or the publications that will hopefully eventually result from our research project that are useful. Our data and software are useful too, because they have this sort of foundational underpinning part. We prioritize making our curated data open because we know that there are hundreds of other researchers who work with air quality and weather data, and they go through the same arduous process of downloading and cleaning the data. It takes weeks of work every time it happens. And by making the software that we use for processing the data open, we added another dimension to the utility of the work. So, so you can use the software in different ways to sort of manipulate, obtain different data sets. So that's all great, but writing software can be really challenging, particularly software that is fit to be even seen, let alone used by other people. So I'm sure this will be familiar to anyone who's written any kind of software. It gets out of date very quickly. And for it to remain sustainable and usable by other people, it's got to be really well written to start with, and ideally supported by people who can help others reuse it. So at this point, I just want to reflect briefly on Sarah's talk and what she was sort of saying with regard to how we approach open science. And I think this is really interesting. And this is something that I think I've sort of tried to think about as part of my own approach to this. So we were very motivated to spend what was a considerable amount of additional time making our software and our data open, because we thought it was important for the community, and we've seen that it is, and we have we're gaining citations from this, so we know that if we make our data open, we'll get citations for it and so on. Going back to the sort of the motivation and the credits that Carol was talking about with her talk. But we also realized that we were really in a position of privilege being able to do this. So I'm very interested in this area. I've been working in open science for a really long time, and I almost take an autoethnographic approach to it, right? So I know it's going to be time consuming, but it's part of my sort of approach to science and ethos, and I enjoy observing what happens and then thinking, okay, how can we improve this process? And that's sort of part of my contribution to the scientific community. We had funding from the Alan Turing Institute that was very flexible, so it sort of allowed us to do what we wanted, and we needed to have some outcomes at the end, but they didn't have to be exactly what we said at the start. And we knew that we were sort of future-proofing. We know this is the future of science, and so we kind of like to be ahead of the game on this. But the other thing I should say is that we were really fortunate to be at Manchester as well, because Manchester is really at the forefront of providing support for this. So a couple of resources that I just wanted to mention. The Software Sustainability Institute is Manchester, Edinburgh, Oxford and Southampton, and it's been a sort of foundational institution underpinning how people write software for a really long time now. So Carol, indeed, was one of the founding PIs at Manchester. And the SSI's mantra is better software, better research, recognising that software that underpins the best possible research, both now and in the future, is software that's written well. So the team that's based at Manchester provides training, helps with support community building, and also has a fellowship programme. So if you're a researcher who codes and you don't know about us, then please do visit our website. And as well as providing practical resources, the SSI also campaigns for the recognition of the vital role that software plays in research. So recently, we provided the REF-approved guidance for software outputs. So this is designed to help universities make the case for software submission, and also help panel members to evaluate these submissions fairly, because they look different potentially to publications. So the other thing that is really important actually is that Manchester has been quietly pioneering in another way. A reason we were able to make the data and code available, thinking about this sort of software being well written to start with, was because we had professional software engineers and data scientists to work on it. So here you can see Anne Gledson, our lead data scientist, and Doug Lowe, our domain expert in research software engineering, who together with Dave Topping, who was our domain science lead from atmospheric science. They're all very experienced in terms of software, and we're all working together to make sure that the software that we produced was reusable by other people. This team's now 30 strong, it's rapidly growing, it's heavily oversubscribed. All the people in it are permanently employed and move from project to project across the university. And if we go back to this software sustainability question again, this is absolutely key. The software that was developed in our Turing project is now being used by Anne in a larger national infrastructure project. That's NERC Digital Solutions. We're able to scale it within the institution, and we can support it for the wider community as well, because we can keep the institutional memory of the work within the RSE team. So this kind of team science, where we don't just read one another's papers, but directly use each other's methods through software, is becoming increasingly important. And of course, this helps to keep Manchester at the forefront of this. I should also say as well that in the same way the library's been working closely with UCL, this is another area where we work really closely with UCL. So both the universities were sort of the first to have these kinds of teams, and with James Hetherington and Jonathan Cooper are very valued colleagues who we often talk to about these matters. And of course, Research IT at Manchester is led by Rob Haynes. So I will finish there, and just wanted to finish by saying that, of course, all of these activities that are happening at Manchester, and including those through the Software Sustainability Institute, the Office for Open Research is going to be a fantastic hub for drawing these together and promoting the excellent resources that we have to support open science here and open research, and hopefully ensure that we can remain at the forefront of computational research as we move into the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. That's really highlighted for us the importance of open and sustainable software to the open research movement. So thanks for that. We do have time for a couple of questions if there's anything in the chat there. I can't see any questions, but I just had one, which is the open source movement has quite a long history, and are there things that the open research movement can learn from that?
Well, yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the main thing, so obviously a lot of open source, and Carol's an expert in this area, a lot of open source software is there to support science. So there's long been a very tight relationship between the two. So I think that one of the key things in terms of learning from it, I guess, is that in order for software to be sustainable, you need to have a community around it who are using it and maintaining it. And I think the other thing that is interesting is thinking about how that's resourced as well. So a lot of it is often volunteer labour, and this can work well in a sort of very delicately balanced ecosystem. But of course, lots of open source is also maintained by industry as well, and it tends to be much more kind of robust, I think, when you have a funding stream to maintain it. So that's always an interesting question. But I don't know, Carol, I don't know whether there's anything you want to add about that.
I think you pretty well covered it quite comprehensively. Yeah, there is actually a very active discussion on that latter point that you put about sustainability and volunteerism, and the kind of assumption that open typically also goes along with unpaid. And this is not true. Cannot be true. There's no such thing as free. I think somebody mentioned that earlier on today. The costs have to be borne of open science, and I think it behoves an organisation like Manchester, for example, to recognise that these costs are borne. And our research software engineers are an example of a group where that is recognised. They're professional people. We can't just continue to rely on unpaid volunteer help, because free labour is slave labour.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, it's so important. So the UKRI is starting to recognise this. So they recently had a software for research communities call. So this wasn't just open source, but this was kind of any software that supports it. It was mostly open source, any software that supports people doing research. And of course, BBSRC, so that was EPSRC's first one. BBSRC have been doing this for a while in various ways. But the difference with the EPSRC one was that it was there to support maintenance of existing software. And it was really clear that it was about, maintaining and developing the software for researchers to use in the future. So this is really a step in the right direction. But the pot was far too small, and there was so much great stuff that could have been funded that would really, really have helped UK science. But we just keep at it. We keep at it.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. So we'll move on then to our final speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Mark Carnell. Mark is the founder of the repository platform Figshare, which provides research data infrastructure for institutions, publishers, and funders globally. And this talk will highlight both the progress in open data as a crucial element of open research, and also the pitfalls for researchers and research, and offer thoughts on a best path forward. And the title is A Decade of Progress in Research Data Practices. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Lorraine. I may have massively overpromised, because 10 minutes, that sounds like a lot to get in 10 minutes, but I'll try my best. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen and we are good to go. And I'll try and keep it to the 10 minutes, but thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the other speakers, and congratulations on opening the Office of Open Research. So I titled it 10 years, a decade of open data, open research, because that's how long I've been working in this space. I came into it out of research around 2011. I met about that time a lot of the presenters that are involved today. But around that time, a lot of the thinking behind open research and the future of research for me came from this book from Microsoft Academic Research. And one of the ideas from a guy called Dr. Jim Gray. So the fourth paradigm, data intensive scientific discovery. And so this is the idea that we've had various paradigm shifting things. One, empirical evidence, the sky is blue. Scientific theory, it's blue every day. Computational science, using computers to help us understand and solve complex problems. And then the fourth paradigm is this ability that the machines will start working with us in order to look for patterns, and very much along the lines of this machine learning AI kind of new paradigm. And Dr. Gray said the aim was not to have the biggest, fastest single computer, but rather to have a world in which all of the science literature is online, all of the science data is online, and they operate with each other. And so implicit in the idea of the fourth paradigm is the ability and the need to share data. And so that's not that long ago. That's 12 years ago. There was this idea that perhaps we can get to this point. And so it's very, this is one of Jim Gray's slides where he says, we have the literature. When we say all scientific data, it's basically all scientific files, all scientific content in a way that humans and machines can read and understand. And so at the top, you've got of the literature, the methods, the context, the reasoning, really the real metadata around the research, right? Why we did it and what we found, how it's novel. And then below that, you can have the derived and recombined data, and below that, the raw data. And so how do we move from the world we were in 2009, 2010 to a world in which more of the content going down this triangle is made available? And what's amazing to see, if you think about that as a grand challenge for a decade, is we've actually seen this happen. So last year, AlphaFold is the most important achievement in AI ever. The words of Forbes magazine, not my own words. But AlphaFold is basically a protein structure database that went from having 36% of all human protein folding structures to 99% overnight, due to the fact that they had homogeneous data sets from Protein Data Bank and UniProt, and they added DeepMind, is the Google-owned AI platform. They added a little machine learning and AI, and they were able to predict protein structure. So it truly is like a shift change, a paradigm change, some might say, in which in academic research, outputs, dissemination. And so that's a huge milestone, but what does it really look like for the rest of research and how we're moving forward? So if we want to look at what else is happening, these are some charts. I'll speed through them. They all go up and to the right, basically, is the spoiler alert. Where you can see this is from a sister organization of ours called Dimensions. the green the number of open access papers now is more than 50% of the papers published every year. So open access has been a long time coming. It takes a huge amount of cultural change, but we can see that that has finally tipped. On the right-hand side, we see that the amount of gold open access papers, which is confusingly the green bar, has grown exponentially. And the amount of green open access papers has gone up, but I think it's an area where I thought we'd do more with, you know, the idea that we don't want to bring in new perverse cost incentives for researchers to publish. Also in that timeline, another exponential chart, the amount of preprints that have been made available. So we've had the archive for a long time, and then you've moved to this idea of all of the different archives, you know, bioarchive and the like. And we've seen that preprints have exploded. And then finally, to round off this set of, you've got the papers moving to open access, you've got the preprints coming out, and then Figshare is, we provide research we provide research infrastructure for organizations, but we also have a free version of Figshare where if you've got nowhere else to make your data available, you can make it available in a generalist repository like Figshare or Zenodo or Dryad. And if you look at the amount of papers that have a DOI from one of those 3 free generalist repositories, you can see that that's also exponentially growing. And if you look at where the papers were funded, you will see that this is not just a UK thing or a Western thing. You know, if we look at the top funders of those papers making open data, you've got Japan, you've got Australia, you've got Canada, you've got Switzerland, you've got China. So it is truly a global phenomenon. And this is, we were talking about, some of the other speakers were talking about carrots and sticks. This is largely a sticks things, right? If funders have a new policy, then the people who are paid by said funders are going to adhere to the policies, which is the researchers. And I think one thing that's come about in the last couple of years is this, okay, fast is good. Getting fast publishing is fantastic. That's one of the problems with dissemination of academic content in general, but it still needs to be good publishing. And I'd say ideally needs to be open publishing too. And it's one of those things that if you pull on one of those strands, then the other two move. So, you know, if you want faster publishing, then the quality of it may diminish a little bit because there's not enough time to do all of the checks. And so with open data, well, with open research in general, the preprints and the open non-traditional research outputs, the non-peer reviewed stuff, we've really seen the pandemic has brought a lot more of this into our consciousness. So we have things like, my mum now understands why there's a need for open data around academic publishing, because you can dig in. So when we looked at ivermectin, you could see things like numbers were unlikely to occur naturally, which is some people might be fudging the data. You can check for that if you have the data sets. Humans tend to, if they make up numbers in a pattern. But also, the percentage is calculated incorrectly, right? The idea that it's not attempting to be fraud or anything like that. It's just that the errors are made and we can correct those errors faster. And this also pulls into this whole, you know, if you want a vaccine, then just being able to build on top of the research that's gone before means that labs can work together in a way that gets past language barriers or anything else. And so the previous way of, you know, data available upon request, all this needs to stop this progress of these labs working together is someone not to reply to that email. Whereas if the data has to be made available at the point of publication, which is a lot of what the policy is saying, then you can just build on top of the research that's gone beforehand without any cultural people barriers, right? So if we're looking back at Jim Gray's slide, we have literature and the data starting to emerge. So we have peer review for literature, but who does the checks for data? We were just talking about, you know, it needs funding, it needs money. Who are the people who are going to do these checks? And where do research institutions and libraries fit into all of this? So for me, just the last couple of minutes on culture, technology, and people. That's the things you need in order to move the needle on open research from what I've seen in my narrow field of view. And so if we look at the people side of things, the researchers, we do a State of Open Data report every year, which is a survey of 5,000 to 10,000 academic researchers trying to ascertain trends in open data. And this one is saying, should the funders be telling their researchers to make their data open? And should the funders be penalizing those who don't make their data open? And there's an overwhelming yes for both of them. 2/3 of people said, yes, you should for both of those things. That's because researchers don't want to be the only person making their data available in a competitive landscape. They want everyone to do it, and then it's an even playing field. So this is why we see things that's been referenced already, the seismic mandate from the NIH. It's big because it's the biggest medical research funder in the world, right? But it's not. There's 57 global funders that mandate open data that they fund already. So it is big, but it's definitely not the first one. In terms of other cultural phenomenon, we see linking papers to supporting data in a repository is associated with, on average, a 25% increase in citations to the paper. It's more reproducible. It makes sense. This was published in PLOS last year, 2 years ago now. And then if we look at the state of open data, what people are saying, there's more concern about sharing data sets than ever before. So if we're looking at the people element, everybody thinks we should be doing this. Everybody knows that this is what the reasons for doing this are, but there's more concern than ever before. If we look at some of the trends, more concerns about misuse of data, you can all guess where that comes from, but other things, not receiving enough credit. I'm unsure if I have permission to do this. I'm unsure how to organize the data. I'm unsure about copyright and data licensing. It's a new thing for a lot of researchers, lots of questions about how to make their data openly available. And this is where I'm saying the last two elements, the people and the technology, come together. When we ask the researchers where they look for help in publishing their data, a third said repositories like Figshare and Zenodo and what have you. A third said publishers like PLOS who have a strong mandate around open data. And a third said the institutional libraries. So there really is this, we know we need to go somewhere for help, but we're not sure where. So having an Office of Open Research will hopefully shift that. Having the technology in place to support researchers like Manchester do with a repository for open data. And then having some kind of people in the mix where you can set it up so researchers will submit files and have them checked to see if they're fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for humans and machines. It's as simple as don't call your data set data set. I say this a lot. The amount of people who call their data set, but don't call their paper, right? That there's a jump there that needs to be made. And subject-specific librarians, folks within the institutional repository, this is the middle of that Venn diagram right there. So going back to Jim Gray, the speed at which any discipline advances will depend on how well its researchers collaborate with one another. We want to remove all those barriers. That's what open research is about, removing any barrier. So if as an research organization, you want to fairly provide access to literature, access to ability to publish the literature, access to data, and ability to publish the data. And if you look in the middle of these people, the tech and the culture, that is where the repositories, the libraries, and the archives sit. So apologies if I've gone over, happy to answer any questions, but that was a bit of a whirlwind tour into some of my thoughts.
Many thanks, Mark. Are there any questions for Mark now? Okay, so we've got one from Fred. Review of data is an interesting idea. How do we begin to approach this when there are already issues with the sustainability in traditional peer review?
That's a great question. So, I mean, these are just my opinions here, and I'd be interested to hear other people's. I for one, think peer review is broken, and we need to support paid peer review. And I have lots of arguments with people about that, but we could go on a whole tangent on that. So we're not going to convince people that they're going to need to spend more of their time doing peer review of data sets. I'd also argue that it's not peer review. If you look at who does what kind of checks you're trying to do, it's more like an editorial service, or it's more like a research integrity part of when you go to publish a paper, before it gets sent off for peer review, they go through is the ethics statement here. You know, just basic checks which do involve humans, and there is a cost. I'm sure we can automate it in the future in some ways, but we're not quite there yet. But that is the checks that we need to do. And with research data, we did a pilot with the NIH. And when you were looking at findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data, obviously interoperable and reusable for humans and machines is the goal, but we really need to start with just the findable and accessible, the good, just well-described metadata. And I think that is where, if you are a research institution who can provide something for their researchers about research data publishing, having someone who can hold their hand through the process once means that they'll know what they're doing a little better the next time. But it's going to take a lot of time to work with everybody to do that. And I think it's not peer review, it's checking the data. Quick check on the metadata in the first instance.
Thank you. And a final question here from Carol. What is the risk of commercial players becoming responsible for research data? Are there any?
Yes, there are. I mean, I put in the slide about gold open access, right? The fact that if I look back over the last 10 years, I think a lot of people who work in libraries and institutional repositories would be thinking that, well, we could just use the institutional repository for green open access. So why are we spending $12,000 to publish in Nature Neuroscience? At the same time, you know, there's always going to be good and bad actors, or there's going to be more aggressive plays in that. And I think you have the Plozes of the world who are a gold open access publisher, but you also have MDPI and other ones that are growing at an exponential rate because they've worked well within the rules of the game, which is, you know, money available for open access publishing. And so I think with the risk of commercial players in the data space, I think that always has to be about what are the contractual agreements that you sign as an organization, and is your data really yours? So if the good thing about most of the open data policies that we see right now is it has to be made openly available. So if you're openly available under licenses that your research institution provides, then anyone can take it anytime and make a backup of it and all of these things under the appropriate conditions. I think there's more of a question around who does the checks on the data and whether that can be commoditized and become a race to zero, and that might also infringe some of the quality of the checks that are being done.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Before I hand back to Scott, I'd just like to say thanks to all 4 speakers today. They've been absolutely brilliant talks, and they've really enriched our launch event today. So thanks, everybody. We will be making the talks available on the website and on social media, and I think Carol and Sarah have already made their slides available too, so thanks for that. I'll hand back now to Scott to close.
Thanks, Lorraine. Just wrestling with PowerPoint. Okay. Just to echo what Lorraine has just said, thank you so much to everybody that's been involved today. I'd like to conclude now the event by spending the last few moments looking ahead to our immediate next steps after the launch today. I would like to just thank everybody that's been involved in from the library side to get us to this point. We're clearly at the starting line, and the speakers today, I can't believe how many big ideas and big challenges have been crammed into 10-15-minute talks. Incredible achievement there, but it just does give us a sense of the challenge ahead, but also of the promise of a better research environment and kind of a set of challenges for us as a library, as an Office for Open Research. Where do we sit here? So really thought-provoking couple of hours. But looking ahead, okay, so we've mentioned that there are 4 key functions to the office. So strategically coordinating our response to the open research agenda is the first key function. So the next thing that we're doing over the next few weeks is to really to develop the briefs and ultimately the business cases for 3 projects around skills training, around helping the university measure our progress as we encourage more uptake of relevant open research practices, and to create and publicize guidelines, policies, and practices for sharing protocols, methodology, and code under open source licenses. So 3 big areas there, and we are really going to benefit from the new Open Research Action Group that Colette was talking about at the beginning. And I really would just echo that sentiment that if anybody's interested in becoming a part of that, then do get in touch with Andrew and Caroline. The next key function is around creating a single point of contact with the expert open research support already available across the university. So I wanted to just kind of mention the architecture actually around this website. We've took it in a slightly different way, and the website is built on a sort of a graph network. So initially, in the first few weeks, it'll look and behave like a traditional website, but hopefully, as we move forward, every piece of content will be a node in the network, and really recognizing the fact that open research looks different across the different disciplines. Hopefully, depending on how you land on the site, you'll see really relevant and connected and useful other information that's available from the website. So really, hopefully, enrich the value and relevance of the website. We'll also be developing our processes to move inquiries around this open research service partnership, and really kind of develop this idea of a one-stop shop for academics. We have, as part of key function 3, we are developing an open research communications campaign, and really, again, going back to some of the things that were said earlier. I think Carol was mentioning that the office can really play a key role in promoting the existence of communities around the university and amplifying messages. So we'll be rolling out a comms campaign over the coming weeks. We have some really, really impressive talking head videos that will be, each video covers a different strand of the open research movement. So we'll be rolling that over the next few weeks. And we're also really, really keen to get more case studies for great open research practice that we can showcase. We do have 10 already that we're ready to go, and we're going to be producing some videos for some of those as well. So lots there down the line. And just finally, we're going to be championing open research whenever we can, wherever we can. So we're going to start a new monthly Open Research Digest from the end of next month. We'll be contacting everybody that's signed up today. We'll be contacting via email, and there'll be an opportunity to sign up and subscribe to this monthly digest. And hopefully it'll be a good resource that brings together the latest developments in this space. And we'll also be showcasing and promoting information through the website through a new news feed. And we've already been asked to amplify and promote an event, a reproducibility bootcamp. This is our first event that we're showcasing and amplifying. So I would encourage everybody to go to our website and go to the news section and just see if you're interested in signing up for this, what looks to be a really, really great event. So with that, I again would like to thank everybody for spending the time with us to celebrate the launch of our office. Thank you again to the speakers for creating what has been a really, really thought-provoking, interesting and challenging 2 hours. I will end now with, we have a nice video that we've had produced. So I'll end now by sharing this video, which is 2 or 3 minutes long, but does a great job of talking about how the office can help embed more open research practice across our institution.
Open research is a movement to make the research process more transparent to the public, to research funders, and to other researchers who might want to build on your work. It's a movement addressing issues with the reproducibility and accessibility of results by promoting innovative new practices in all areas of scholarship. There are so many ways to be open, you might ask, how do I start applying open research principles to my own work? The Office for Open Research is answering this question. We're providing a single point of access to open research support from across the university. When you contact us, we'll link you up with an expert who could be one of your peers and help you access the resources and advice you need. We'll also help you find other researchers doing the same things in the open research community, which is already thriving at the University of Manchester. Whatever your research area, you can start thinking about open research at every stage of the research process. There are ways you can incorporate open practices straight into what you're doing already. such as writing reproducible code or documenting your lab work electronically. You might also be inspired by innovative open methodologies, engaging with communities that would not be reached by traditional approaches. You can start at any stage in your project. After devising your initial research questions, you can make the choice to pre-register your hypotheses, methods, and analyses. You could engage with research participants to co-produce your work, or encourage public participation in research through a citizen science initiative. Or if you're closer to publishing and sharing your research, we can help you with publishing preprints, fair and open research data, and open access publishing. At the Office for Open Research, we believe that research output should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary when some details might be confidential. Our partners include experts in research data management, information governance, and export control, providing the right guidance when you need it. Providing great open research support is one of the foundations of our programme to change the research culture at Manchester. We're developing skills, supporting communities, and promoting transparency for all researchers and at all stages of the research process.